as things have developed, I guess we all became more and more aware that there were problems associated with the heavy use of agricultural chemicals. And I would just say that when these materials were first introduced and farmers began to adopt them in the late 50s and 60s, very few people anticipated that there would be any problems, and the benefits were clearly enormous.
Yes.
And it's not at all hard to understand why farmers adopted these methods, and as I say, we left really before that trend set in heavily, but all of my relatives and other friends have chosen that form of agriculture, understandably, which is one reason that I've never personally, or here at the Institute, we've never pointed the finger of blame at farmers for doing this kind of thing. It made perfect sense from an economic point of view, and it was a rational sort of decision, and they were being encouraged to do this by their land-grant universities and other advisors. So that's a trend that started out for very rational reasons. But now, of course, we know there are some problems with that.
We know more now.
Yes.
And that's the reason for looking at things differently. So you went to USDA from Illinois to Washington.
Well, there were some stop-offs for some college teaching in between.
Okay.
When I left the university in 1970, I taught for 3 years at Iowa State University in the Department of Political Science. And then we moved to Southwest Missouri, where I taught again for 4 years at Southwest Missouri State University. And I guess it would have been 1977 we left there and moved across the state. We've sort of adopted Missouri as our home for a while. And I became chairperson of the Department of Political Science at Southeast Missouri State University for 2 years. But while I was at Southwest, it's hard to keep these various parts of Missouri straight here, I'm sure, but I wrote a paper called The Alternative Agriculture Movement, in which I just basically did some very basic research, trying to find out who was out there, who was involved in this movement, what they believed, what their ideology was, what they hoped to obtain, what they wanted from government or didn't want from government, how successful they were, and that sort of thing. Well, that research resulted in a publication in the Policy Studies Journal, and I can only assume that someone at USDA must have read that article, and that's what led to the invitation to come in to this city and to become part of USDA in 1979 and become part of what was an interdisciplinary team that had been asked to do a survey and an analysis of organic farming in the United States by Secretary Berglund.
Now, is this the report and recommendations on organic farming?
That's that is the one.
It's really a cutting-edge document. And you were still at Missouri when you were involved in this?
Yes. Well, I was at Southeast by that time, although the paper had been written a few years before that when I was at the other university in Missouri. So we moved in June of 1979, just 12 years ago. And it was very happy to get here and to find out that, as the fates would have it, under Secretary Berglund's leadership and others, that an excellent team had been assembled, present company accepted. But some of the finest scientists in the department had agreed to become part of this study.
Is 79.
79.
And you're being too modest, Garth. You're called the organic G-man in this article in New
I've been
Farm.
called lots of things, but I think we ought to go on past that part, probably.
Well, I particularly like this article and appreciated the fact that it was written with a great deal of hope for what you were doing at that time. And,
well, I think there was a lot of hope, and there still is. Secretary Berglund, as you know, was quite supportive of this, and in fact requested the study. He's been misunderstood and misrepresented on this, as many have. I know Bob Berglund, and he would be the last person to want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say that we ought to switch totally to organic farming systems immediately and that kind of thing. But he was aware from his own farming experience and some of the not relatives, but friends who farm near him of some very successful operations. And so it seemed logical, and many others feel it was logical, to ask the question, how many others are doing this? And how do you account for their success? How can they be this productive without the use of chemicals? In some cases none, or very limited sparing amounts of chemical inputs. And so that's really what spawned the study, was his desire to simply find out a little bit more about what was going on. Because at that time, very little work had been done, virtually none.
We're talking about your work in Washington when you first came.
Yes.
And how exciting that was.
Well, it was a very exciting period because there was a lot of support from the secretarial level. And as I mentioned, the department had assembled a wonderful team of scientists, chaired by Bob Papendick from an ARS scientist stationed at Pullman, Washington, people like Jim Parr and Jim Swan and others. We had a team of about 10 or 12 individuals who worked at various points along the way on this report, which was finally published in the spring of, or perhaps early summer of 1980. I don't remember the exact date. But we made the decision early on as a team to go out and do farm-level interviews. And in retrospect, that was clearly the most critical decision we made. I think if we had done a library, laboratory kind of report, it would have sounded a lot different. But as, because, and perhaps this is worth pointing out, most of the scientists who became part of that team did it because they had curious minds and they were good scientists. But I don't think they came to the project with any preconceived ideas that they were going to be terribly impressed with what they found. But they were willing to go out and look. And I still hold them in high regard for that reason. So the decision was made to go out and do on-farm case studies, and we did 69, a few in all 10 production regions in the United States. And frankly, we're just very impressed with what we found. And we would come back and sort of debrief each other on the farm visits we had done and what we had found. And it was interesting to see how the enthusiasm of the team, particularly those that had gone out and done interviews, began to build over the course of the summer and into the fall as we completed the interviews. Because these, as I say, these were high-level, top-level, top-drawer scientists who were finding some things in the soil structure, soil quality, life of the soil, soil microbiology, in these organic farms that obviously had been using green manures in the rotation and applying animal manures and reincorporating crop residues properly and so forth. They were just very, very impressive. And so the feeling on the team, at least, by the time we were ready to write the report, was that this is something worth looking at. Again, no one was saying we ought to drop all of the chemicals and start farming organically universally in the country, but there was a clear feeling that this was a productive, viable option or alternative for farmers that deserved some support. And so we recommended, I think, 10 pages of research that we thought could usefully be done by USDA. And with a good reception at the secretarial level and by Dr. Bertrand, who at that time was the Assistant Secretary for Science and Education, I think there was a feeling, I think euphoria would be a little bit too strong, because very soon after the report was published, negative responses began to emerge as well. We can go into that a little bit if you'd like, but at least on the team and in most parts of the department, there was a feeling that we ought to put some money into this, and we ought to start looking at it and providing these farmers with some research and educational backup. And so it was an exciting time. It really was.
A question about your team members. Were they from different disciplines?
Yes, it was a truly interdisciplinary team.
How exciting.
And we've heard a lot of talk about the need for that in recent years, but we had one. There were soil scientists, and, agronomists, and plant pathologists, and entomologists, and it was economists, and myself as a policy person. They wanted that dimension involved, and so I think that was one of the most exciting and rewarding experiences of my life, really, to be involved in that kind of a team, to begin to see how it really is a system out there, and you do need these various perspectives. One of the parts of the study that was most enlightening, I guess, was a 10-day tour of organic farms in Europe. And as we went around to these farms and interviewed farmers and scientists in some instances who were involved. It was fascinating how we would have different questions to ask, no pre-planning. It was just that different things occurred to different members of the team. And I think that was perhaps the one experience that impressed upon me more than anything else the urgent need to pursue the interdisciplinary approach to this work. It's been said 10,000 times since then in conference and so on, so I'm certainly not saying anything new here. But it is critical, and it's exciting to see universities beginning to move in that direction.
Yes, it is, and I want to talk a little bit more about that later, but what countries did you visit before we leave your tour?
I guess Germany and Switzerland and England were the three that... It was a short and hurried kind of tour, but still enlightening.
Perspective.
Yes.